Hello and welcome to this webinar in association with IQEQ. In this session, we'll be discussing the attraction of the Netherlands and the UK as a destination for SPACs, the benefits and challenges of the vehicle, and the opportunities for private equity firms, as well as much more. I'm Talia Masiri, editor of Real Deals, and today I'm joined by Arnaud Delestin, member of the Executive Committee of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, and Anne-Fleur de Houle, associate at Noorderlith. We will be joined by two other speakers shortly, but in the meantime, I think we should get started. So Anne-Fleur and Arnaud, if you wouldn't mind just quickly giving a brief introduction to yourselves and your firms, so our speakers can get a bit more of an understanding, and then we'll get into the discussion. So Arnaud, would you mind starting us off?
Sure. Thank you, Talia, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you today and to contribute to this interesting discussion around SPACs. So my name is Arnaud Delestin. I am Director of International Capital Markets and member of the Executive Committee at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. And for those who wouldn't know what the Luxembourg Stock Exchange does, it's obviously a stock exchange, but very much active in the field of international securities, be they debt securities, but also equities, funds.
Perfect. Thanks, Arnaud. And obviously look forward to discussing more about your experience with SPACs and what you've been seeing in the market on the exchange. And Fleur, could you follow, please? Hi.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Talia. And also thank you very much for the invitation. Good afternoon, everyone. It's quite strange that I can't actually see you. So my name is Anne-Fleur de Houle. I'm an associate at the capital market team of Noorderlith. I've broad experience in the field of mergers and acquisitions, debt capital markets, and also a lot of experience in the equity capital markets field. My main focus over the last year and a half has been SPACs. For example, I've worked on the Pegasus Europe SPAC, which was the biggest SPAC in Europe up to date, and the Hede Sophia SPAC. As regards my firm is a Dutch law firm mainly. We have offices in Luxembourg and Belgium, where we practice also local law, but the Dutch firms are located in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and also London and New York, and we are a full service firm. So apart from all the transactional work, we also do litigation work.
Perfect. Thanks, Anne-Fleur. And I believe we have Emma joining us now as well. Wait for her. Hi, Emma. How are you? Hi, Emma.
Hello.
Hi. Hi, everyone. So we have Emma Korsovic, who's Director of Corporates at IQEQ, who's just joined us. Emma, would you mind just following? So Arnaud and Anne-Fleur have just given a background into themselves and their role. So would you mind giving a brief introduction to yourself as well, please?
Welcome. Can you hear me now or not?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
I was just saying, if you don't mind giving a quick introduction to yourself and your role at
Sure. Apologies for the delay. I had some computer issues, as we all sometimes have. My name is Emma Chauschwitz. I'm a Director of Corporates at IQEQ, Netherlands, and responsible for our Dutch SPAC offering. One of my areas of expertise is providing corporate administration services and corporate governance services to SPACs.
Great. Thanks, Emma. I look forward to hearing more from you. So just to start, clearly just to a few points to note to the audience, we do encourage questions. So if you have any, please do send them through and we'll look to answer those at the end of our discussion today. So I think to start, perhaps it will be good to give a brief description to an explanation to our listeners today in terms of what a SPAC is, what it looks like for those who may not be as familiar with it. Emma, are you able to give a quick summary at all?
Yes, a SPAC is commonly referred to as a blank check company. It stands for Special Purpose Acquisition Company, and it's actually a company that initially has no commercial operations and is formed solely to raise capital through an IPO. After the capital is raised and placed into an escrow account, the SPAC seeks to acquire an existing privately held company. Prior to having a specific target for the business combination, the SPAC raises the funds through a public offering of the SPAC's equity security. And a SPAC typically has 2 years to make an acquisition, subject to a potential extension. So that's, I think, a short outline of a SPAC. Maybe if other speakers want to add something to this.
Yeah, does anyone have anything to add at all? I think that was nicely summarized. No, perfect. Okay, well, thank you, Emma.
Sure.
So I guess why we're having this discussion today is because of the increase in interest and activity in the Netherlands and Luxembourg when it comes to SPACs. So perhaps to start off, Anne Fleur, could we get your views on kind of why SPACs are gaining traction in Europe? Kind of what are the key drivers of this?
Yeah, sure, of course. Well, maybe to provide a bit of background, SPACs have become very popular in the US stock market during 2019, 2020. And people thought, let's also try this in Europe. And that resulted in this major boom over the last year and a half in SPACs in Europe. For example, previously, we only had one SPAC listed on Euronext Amsterdam. And over the past year, there were over 20 SPACs IPOing on Euronext Amsterdam. So that's a major boom. The next thing to look at is why are SPACs so popular? Well, thing is that from the sponsor's perspective, so those that are the persons or the companies behind the SPAC, is that the SPAC structure offers a lot of upsides. Usually they can acquire a 20% stake, which is quite a significant stake in the SPAC company, which is eventually will be the 20% stake in the public listed company, but they buy the shares at nominal value. So they have actually a low risk with the money they invest in the SPAC. For the target company, it's an alternative route to become a public company, but as opposed to traditional IPO, the valuation can be negotiated privately with the SPAC instead of having to do that publicly. For investors, it's also very interesting because investors get to vote on the business combination and their investment risk is quite low. They get around 99% of their investment back if the business combination is not completed timely or if they vote against it.
Oh, really interesting. Okay, so kind of low risk is likely to be kind of one of the key benefits there.
Exactly.
Okay, really interesting. Thanks, Anne Fleur. And Arnold, what are your thoughts on this? Kind of what are the key drivers from your perspective in terms of this increased in interest in SPACs in Europe?
I think Anne Fleur gave a very good overview of what are the different drivers for the stakeholders around the SPAC transaction, be they target company, investor, sponsors. I think SPAC, first of all, is nothing new, right? It's been around for decades, but it's sure that it's got the kind of spotlight over the past couple of years. First in the US, then moving now into Asia and Europe, and there is probably a very good reason for that is that the macroeconomic environment probably created the conditions for a rise in SPAC popularity. We all know about this rock bottom yield environment in which we operate, so which obviously can be addressed. At least you have the prospect through a SPAC transaction to deliver some additional return. So there's interest definitely in Europe, and since capital markets are by essence global, I think it's important for the European financial industry to play its role and mobilize to actually serve its own economy. Otherwise, others will definitely do it. Now, I think perhaps one additional point from my side is that what is quite interesting here is that SPACs, by enabling European SMEs to attract new capital inflows, and also to a certain extent, for some of them, by facilitating an increased or direct participation from retail investors, are actually in principle aligned with two key objectives of the Capital Markets Union. So they basically contribute to channeling capital more efficiently where it's most needed. So no surprise that we've seen European SPAC activity kicking off the ground and that there is interest there.
Yeah, Yeah, definitely, that makes sense. And Arnold, just a quick follow-up there. Do you think the pandemic has had anything to do with this increase, or is it more the economy and the changing regulatory landscape in Europe that's kind of led the rise in SPAC activity?
Well, I guess it has influenced both directly and indirectly what we are observing today, right? Certainly, as with any big crisis, you've got opportunity surfacing. So certainly, it has triggered this kind of reflection in many different sectors with the potential that SPACs can offer, and certainly, I guess it feeds a number of discussions that are taking place at present across Europe.
Yeah, definitely. Great, thanks, Arnold. And Emma, from your perspective, what kind of has activity been like in the specific regions that you work within?
So I'm based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. As Anne Fleur briefly mentioned, what we see in 2021, approximately 30 SPACs have been listed so far at Euronext in Europe, and Euronext Amsterdam has been taking the lead with over 40% of the European SPAC listings. What we see is why they like to choose the Netherlands. It's because the Netherlands is a very stable, a reputable jurisdiction with a flexible legislative system.
Mm-hmm.
We see that European bankers are looking to Amsterdam as a launchpad for SPACs, since it's a relatively straightforward place to list SPACs. And the Amsterdam Stock Exchange had an early lead in developing SPAC expertise. So that's actually what we see. We see throughout 2020, we saw a slight increase, but now it's rather like booming in the Netherlands. I don't know, Anne Fleur, how you see, because you're also based in Amsterdam.
Yeah, sure. I can. I definitely agree with your point of view, Emma. I think also, of course, when there is one SPAC listed, that attracts other SPACs as well.
Yeah.
In our experience in the beginning, when the SPAC boom just started in the Netherlands, we as a firm, we really put in a lot of time to discuss with all of the parties involved, such as Euronext, the AFM, Euroclear, all the agency banks, to totally, to work out and set up the whole mechanism of the SPAC. We really sort of had to invent the wheel in that respect.
Yeah.
That really took a lot of time. And finally, we now have a smooth path to do a SPAC IPO. But that's really something, I guess, to consider as well. If anyone considers to set up a SPAC somewhere in Europe, that it would be very wise, I guess, to choose for a venue that already has experience with setting up a SPAC. That takes.
Yeah, and then to add, I've worked with Anne Fleur. We have some mutual clients, so they're advising from the legal and tax point of view, and we are more focused from the corporate administration point of view. So it's actually a total package.
So great. And really interesting to kind of hear about the benefits of listing us back in the Netherlands, and perhaps kind of the ease of regulation there as opposed to other places in Europe, perhaps. I know I said I'd do questions at the end from the audience, but perhaps we could take one now. Arnold, there's one on from an anonymous attendee, that what is the volume of deal flow like in Europe, and how are targets viewing SPACs versus IPOs? So in terms of listings there, what's your experience? What are you seeing?
I think I'd love to obviously, quote the same kind of numbers. The reality is that when it comes to Luxembourg, there's been a fair amount of transactions actually originating in Luxembourg, and of SPACs vehicle being incorporated in Luxembourg, as we know that the legal or the corporate law framework there is quite attractive for those transactions. We also know that the regulator, the CSSF, is also quite reactive and thanks to a quite an experience in innovation in terms of financial products. I think the second part of the question was, how do we compare SPACs to IPOs? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
That's I'd love also to hear the views of my colleagues on the panel. But certainly, our understanding is that SPACs come with a number of advantage in terms of time to market, in terms of cost overall, in terms of complexities, because of the nature of the SPAC vehicle, which has not an operational activity per se. Some also mention from time to time an advantage in terms of pricing. So at what actually valuation you can close the transaction, which certainly with an IPO is much more volatile and some uncertainty there, and also some stability that may come through a SPAC transaction that you may not benefit from through a standard IPO process.
Sure.
So those would be my points, but I'm happy to leave the floor to Emma and Anna Fleur to complete this picture.
Perfect. Thanks, Arnaud. And Fleur, I believe you've got something to add to that.
Yes, that's correct. So I think also something to consider here is that in an IPO, of course, there's also a timeline set out with the target company if you have a traditional IPO. Mm-hmm. But when you have a SPAC, like the de-SPAC, the de-SPAC timeline, if the SPAC is negotiating with a target, of course, the SPAC is bound to the 2-year timeline. And if they do not complete the business combination, so if they do not merge or acquire a target company within the 2 years, then the sponsors, they lose the money they put in the SPAC, which is used for the whole setup of the SPAC, the IPO of the SPAC, and the hunt for a suitable target. So the board of the SPAC, the sponsors are really inclined to complete a business combination within the 2-year time frame. So that pressure, they are more incentivized to close a deal and maybe get more terms that are more target friendly when it comes to the deal, to the agreement.
Sure. That's really interesting. I guess there's that pressure really kind of encourages them to take more of an active role. And we are having a lot of questions come through. Just a very quick one, if anyone could answer that, in terms of what is the minimum viable size of a SPAC. Do any of you have a quick fire answer to that at all? Or an average? No, maybe we'll come back to it. Arnaud?
No. Honestly, I would refrain from giving a number. I would like to think that actually it all depends on the kind of targeted geographies or targeted sectors, and what we've seen perhaps so far is a SPAC of a certain dimension, certain size. But as the product becomes more and more used, perhaps we're going to see emerging, smaller SPACs. And so I think honestly, I would be tempted to answer there's no ideal size actually.
Okay, fair enough. Good answer. I see the panelists nodding in agreement with you there. And Fleur, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, just maybe a small comment to add there is that usually the minimum size of the SPAC, the sponsors can think of that by themselves, but in practice, if they find a suitable target, then usually additional capital will need to be raised anyway, because it's usually not enough to actually acquire the company. Sure,
that makes sense. Thank you. And now going back to our discussion around kind of looking at the Netherlands and Luxembourg. Arnaud, I had a question for you on the Luxembourg side in terms of what has Luxembourg done to become SPAC friendly? What are the benefits of listing there?
Yeah. The thing is that I was asking myself, when preparing for this, do we really have such fundamental differences between US exchanges and European exchanges, or even between European exchanges themselves, in terms of listing rules? And is this really what is driving basically SPACs to list rather in the US or in Europe? And to be honest, I think having done, when we established our own guidelines, and I come back to that in a second, but we did a kind of comparison, an analysis about, what were the different listing frameworks between US and several European countries. And I think what we conclude is that we've got certainly a convergence on the principles, but definitely different in terms of what thresholds are being applied. So I think by and large, the rules and the key principles are the same. But certainly in the details, you've got some variations. In a nutshell, what we consider in terms of venues, and I'm sure regulators would consider as well, is the kind of completeness, comprehensibility, consistency of the information that is made available to investors. What we did at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange earlier this year is we took the initiative to consult with a number of market practitioners to design a set of guidelines to complement our standard rules and regulations around equity instruments, which were not as specific as SPACs may be requiring, and to respond to a growing number of questions that were being raised with regard to admissions of SPACs on our different market segments. And objectives pursued there were twofold, right? To provide more guidance to the SPAC sponsors and promoters in the structuring, in the launch, the listing of their vehicle, but also making sure that we preserve we preserve investor protection, we preserve market integrity overall, which is our role as an exchange, right, as a marketplace. When doing so, what we did is we thought about the best approach, and because each SPAC is fundamentally very different, and because not only the launch of the SPAC but also the de-SPAC process is going to be a kind of bespoke case. We thought that the guidelines should rather remain light and generic, still providing a direction, but any case is going to require kind of in-depth individual review. So that's how we designed the guidelines. They're light, they're generic, but hopefully still helpful for the community to better prepare, to engage with us and support the listing on our market. And those guidelines also were designed also with the spirit of enhancing the Luxembourg capital market offering. And I think Anne-Fleur or Emma, I'm not sure, mentioned about how important it is to have a kind of ecosystem that supports end-to-end the SPAC processing. Well, in Luxembourg, we obviously have that benefit as well, right? I mentioned the regulator itself, which is part of this ecosystem, which plays a very important role, especially with the time-to-market dimension of SPACs. But also the market infrastructure, like the stock exchange, like the post-trade infrastructure in Luxembourg with Clearstream and Lux CSD. But also, more importantly, all the market experts that are there, bankers, law firms, advisors, private equity firms, and the fund community, which is very much present there.
Sure, really interesting. Thank you, Arnaud. And Emma, if I could quickly throw it back to you. We've had another question similar to what we're discussing at the moment in terms of whether the Netherlands is more advantageous than Luxembourg. What are your views? Are they quite similar, having heard what Arnaud has said, or is there anything that makes the Netherlands stand out as a jurisdiction?
I think, and please, Anne-Fleur, add also your thoughts. I think in the Netherlands, Dutch law provides great flexibility. And for example, what we see in the more recent listings in Amsterdam is that flexibility under Dutch law provides us to closely mirror the US model in SPACs. I think also the AFM, so the Dutch market authorities, are also quite lenient to help list the SPACs. So I think that's from more a Dutch perspective. I don't know, Anne-Fleur, I know you're a lawyer, so maybe you have other thoughts.
No, I agree with that. That's totally correct. And also, I think the main question to go for either Luxembourg or the Netherlands is mainly a tax-driven question.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Just kind of what is preferable for that specific company, perhaps, when it comes to taxes. Fair enough. I believe we may have our final speaker on the line. Pascal, are you there?
Talia, thanks. So just sorry for being late. Just facing big lot of issues with my IT system. So sorry on my cell right now. So I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm here now.
We can hear you. Thank you, Pascal. No problem at all. Unfortunately, there are always tech issues that all of us, I'm sure, have experienced before. So that's absolutely fine. Pascal, could we perhaps jump into, so we've kind of done a bit of a comparison here on Netherlands and Luxembourg and kind of their those areas as places for listing SPACs. But clearly, kind of as we've all established, the US has been the leader in this. So from your view, what are the differences in US and European listing rules which have made kind of the US more SPAC friendly at present?
That's a good question, but maybe I can summarize, because just maybe to have a look at the figures and number of SPACs. So maybe, as you know, in 2020, SPAC IPOs in the US raised more funds than all preceding years combined, I would say. So SPAC IPOs raised the largest amount of funds between January and August 2021, with the value of funds raised already exceeding, I would say, more than 100 billion in USD. That's huge. So the US SPAC boom, I would say, can be explained by a large amount of dry powder available and an attractive SPAC listing rule, such as the freedom to withdraw their money once, I would say, a SPAC announces a target acquisition. As you know as well, some of Europe's main stock exchange, such as Amsterdam, for instance, have a similar structure to the US, and this had made this jurisdiction more appealing for SPAC listing, I would say. So, in conclusion, my view on this point, I would say the SPAC boom is slowing down in the United States, where the SEC has issued cautionary statements on SPACs, on financial reporting and audit consideration, as well as on the rise in overvalued targets in the de-SPAC process. But at the end of the day, I'm pretty sure for now we are seeing the SPAC boom moving from the US to Europe, with leading jurisdictions such as Luxembourg, for instance, adopting a new framework for SPAC listing. I think that's the current trend, that's what we see. But just to be honest, yesterday afternoon, I got a discussion with one of my colleagues in the US, and they confirmed this point, but they said that maybe in the coming days, weeks, and maybe months, the US market will be booming again. So I'm pretty sure in 2022, we'll have, let's say, continental Europe and the US, we have a very strong market for SPACs, I'm pretty sure.
Interesting. We'll keep our eyes out to see if your prediction comes true then, and to see if that does take.
We will see.
Well, I'm sure we'll have a discussion about it again then. Okay, and then Emma, looking at private equity specifically, so when it comes to PE, why are SPACs being used increasingly by as funding structures? What are your views on that?
I think private equity firms are always eager to identify new ways to raise and deploy capital. And SPACs represent a great way also to access investment opportunities. So I think SPACs are attractive to PE firms for a number of reasons. Some were, I think, mentioned by Arnaud before. I think it provides a more efficient and faster IPO process. You have lower financial transaction costs. It gives you a greater control over deal terms. It provides you greater access to capital. It releases liquidity options that are not always available to private equity. So I think there are a number of reasons why it's very attractive for them to make use of this vehicle.
Okay, yeah, really interesting. Thanks, Emma. And Fleur, do you have anything to add to that in terms of the benefits of SPACs for private equity firms?
I think Emma pretty much covered anything. The only thing to notice, and that's more of a legal point, is that what we really should be careful about is when we structure the SPAC, that we also structure it in such a way that it will never qualify as an investment fund, because then the SPAC cannot raise money as a SPAC. So it's really different from a PE fund, because the SPAC will essentially become the public company. It's sort of pre-good IPO, which is very interesting, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And we did have a question on it here. Sorry, I'm just finding it. So have any of you seen private equity funds considering SPACs as a kind of strong vehicle for an exit? Is that something that's taking place?
Yeah, that's something I do see and hear, I get questions about. So that's something some private equity funds are definitely considering.
Okay, great, really interesting. And then moving on, so Anne Fleur, how can Luxembourg and Netherlands be used as SPACs? So obviously we've kind of discussed the benefits of it, but in terms of kind of how can the passport mechanism so that was set by the prospectus regulation be used to list the vehicles on the Paris and Frankfurt stock exchanges?
Yeah, sure. Well, maybe good to note first that in practice, actually, the SPAC securities are quite always only offered to professional investors in Europe only. So therefore, there's not really a need to actually passport the SPAC prospectus to another EU member state. However, if that is something that is happening, then passport procedure can be very easy. If you incorporate a SPAC and you want to list that SPAC on either the Luxembourg Stock Exchange or the Amsterdam Euronext Stock Exchange, you have to go to the prospectus approval procedure with the local regulator. For Euronext Amsterdam, that will be the AFM. And once they approve the prospectus, you can easily passport the prospectus to one of the other EU member states, such as the Frankfurt or the Paris Stock Exchange.
Okay, really interesting. And is that common? When was that put into place?
I'm sorry?
When was that put into place, that kind of passport mechanism? When does it kind of become more established? Yeah,
so that came into place actually when the prospectus regulation came into place, which is applicable in all of the EU member states, and that was, top of my head, 2019. Sure.
Sorry to put you on the spot there. I know to one, so but no, really interesting. Thanks for outlining that. And Arno, what other features make these countries attractive? We've kind of discussed them at a high level, but what about in terms of how they can be used against other potential routes of listing?
Well, I think we've kind of touched upon it already, right, in the previous question. But certainly, I can certainly talk about Luxembourg in more details. I think one of Anne Fleur or Emma mentioned the corporate legal framework, which is a very important driving factor, which is hopefully in Luxembourg also seen as flexible and meeting the needs and delivering at least options that are close to what you can see in the US. But it's much more than a framework. It's as I said earlier, it offers a complete, well-integrated, business-oriented ecosystem to assist the SPAC sponsors to list and de-SPAC. What I would add to that is again the fact that you will have access to an ecosystem of experts, that very well know what a SPAC transaction is, who understand and master cross-border legal and fiscal implications of these structures, and ultimately ensure an end-to-end processing that is as smooth as you could think, right? So I think that's really, if I had to single out one point, it would be that ecosystem that makes the difference.
Yeah, definitely. And then on that point, perhaps we could go to Pascal. So clearly, we've outlined the strengths of Luxembourg and the Netherlands for SPACs. But what about London, the city I'm based in at the moment? Will the reforms undertaken by the LSC around SPACs make London an attractive location for these vehicles as well?
Thanks. That's a very good question, because with the Brexit, London is the center of the world for now. But to make a long story short, I would say London could be one of the preferred locations in the coming years for sure. As you know, UK regulatory bodies are very pragmatic. That's why the UK FCA a few months ago has initiated a consultation on the proposed changes to the listing rules for SPACs. You know, in order to allow more SPAC activity in UK markets, they wanted to understand the potential issues and what they had to do. So it was a very good idea to launch such a consultation. But it was the case that a SPAC listing is suspended if it identifies as an acquisition target. So a rule designed to prevent disorderly trading in a SPAC share. That was the case before. So I would say the outcome is that investors are locked into a SPAC as soon as the target is announced, which has made them less desirable for UK investors. Makes sense. So the FCA has published on July 2021, on the 27th, I think, the final rules and changes to its listing rules, just for SPACs, which now allows investors to exit prior to any acquisition being completed.
Okay.
So it has also included some additional disclosure, such as ensuring money raised from public shareholders is ring-fenced and requiring shareholders' approval for any proposed acquisition, with the objective of, I would say, promoting investor protection. That's the motto for such a new development, investor protection. So the new rules came into force on August 2021. I don't remember exactly the date, but on August 2021. So my view on that, so the result of such regulation seems quite clear for the UK. The UK market should be even more appealing than it was before because of the investor protection, because if the investors feel more confident, they will invest more. I think that's the mindset of such a new regulation.
Definitely. It'll be interesting to see that now that protection is in place and that emphasis on investor protection is there, whether more kind of firms in the UK will look to list as SPAC. Yeah, very interesting. Okay, and is there, from your perspective and from your experience, are there any kind of key differences in terms of that regulation on UK SPACs as opposed to the Netherlands and Luxembourg and the rest of Europe? So that was to Pascal.
It was for Emma, I think, no?
Oh, sorry, Emma, yes, if you have any views there.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So looking at kind of from what Pascal's outlined in terms of the new regulation in the UK and the listing SPACs, are there any kind of clear differences? Are there any benefits perhaps that might drive investors to the UK to list as opposed to Netherlands and Luxembourg?
To be honest, I think I can only answer from a Dutch perspective because I'm based in the Netherlands. So I can only answer this question from a Dutch perspective.
I guess as Pascal said, it's a very new regulation and introduction in the UK.
Yeah.
So we'll have to wait and see, and what the comparisons are will kind of come out in time as well. Okay, and now I think.
But, just to jump on your question, at the end of the day, I think we don't need to, I would say, to split between the UK, Luxembourg, or the Netherlands. At the end of the day, it's as I mentioned before, we start with let's say with the SPACs history in the US, and now it's moving to continental Europe. So continental Europe, I would say, including the UK. I don't talk about the Brexit, but including the UK. And I think the UK will not, of course, will compete with Luxembourg and with the Netherlands. But at the end of the day, it's a move to continental Europe, including the UK. That's what we are seeing now. So and then why UK versus Luxembourg versus Netherlands? It's a question of course of market, the size of the market first of all. The second one maybe the flexibility of the rules on the stock exchange. So Arnaud, of course, can develop on that. But of course, it will be competition between this type of countries. But the main I think the main element is a move between the US to continental Europe, and sorry, because it's not part of this webinar today, but do not forget Hong Kong and Singapore. It's something to discuss maybe in another webinar in the coming days, weeks, and months. But Singapore and Hong Kong, let's say, will try to attract new investors, and they will, of course, the new listing rules for SPACs in Singapore. So has been released a few days ago. So it's globally, it's not UK versus Luxembourg, Netherlands. It's US, continental Europe, including the UK and Asian countries. That's what we see on the market right now.
Yeah.
If I may, Talia, just perhaps to bounce back on what was just said, I think it's important to highlight that within Europe, and with this now, UK is obviously out of it, but within Europe, there's obviously also a very well-defined regulatory framework for stock exchange to operate, right? And so the prospectus regulation, as we've said, the transparency directive, all of this is in place. And so it's not like, there is a lack of guidance. What was probably lacking here is a lack of specific guidance considering the nature and the features of a SPAC, which is why you've seen this type of guidelines surfacing here and there, right? But overall, there is a well-defined framework for, capital market participants to structure the transaction and get them approved by the competent authorities and then listed, right? Yeah. So what I feel is that, as I said earlier, there isn't any fundamental difference between all those frameworks. Yes, there will be difference in the thresholds, in the size, in the number of parameters, but fundamentally, it all goes in the direction of protecting investors and ensuring a maximum transparency on the mechanism under which the SPAC will operate. I think that's the key goal here that are being pursued.
Sure, that makes sense.
Agree. Yeah.
Okay, and
regulation is the main driver for sure.
Sure, that makes sense. And Fleur, we've had a question come through here, and I'm wondering perhaps from your legal perspective, on kind of around the challenges that you may see when cross-border challenges around kind of if the SPAC invests outside of its home country, what could be potential obstacles or issues here?
Yes, so I think that really depends on where the target company is actually incorporated. Usually what we would strongly advise, and which will be very difficult if the target company is located outside of the EU, then it will become very difficult, because what essentially you will do at some point is that the SPAC, and we can structure that in many different ways, merges with the target company. And you cannot just simply do that with a company that is incorporated in a jurisdiction outside of the EU. Okay. For a company that is incorporated within the EU, we have very different rules, and then you can merge with a company. But then, of course, you have to take into account the various corporate structures, some classes of shares we may have in the Netherlands, but we don't have that in maybe another jurisdiction, even though it is within the EU. So that, of course, brings a lot of legal questions with it. But yeah, of course, we have ways to solve that, but it's not as straightforward as it may look.
Sure. But I guess kind of the message there is either if you're within or without the EU, looking to list a SPAC in the EU, you need kind of legal advice. You need that advisory assistance in the diligence process.
Definitely. That's not just me marketing us lawyers, but that's something I would strongly advise for.
Of course, no, definitely. Okay, and now moving on to kind of looking at, obviously we've established there has been a trend, there has been a growth in interest in SPACs. And I think even from the amount of questions that have come through today show people's interest and enthusiasm for the vehicle. So Anne, Fleur and Emma, if I could come to you two first in terms of, is this growing popularity of SPACs just a bubble at the moment, or is this trend here to stay? What do we think on that? Anne, Fleur, could I come to you again first?
Yeah, sure. Well, as far as I'm aware, because what I hear in the market and also what I and our firm is working on, there are still quite some SPACs in Europe in the pipeline. But it's more interesting, I guess, to have a look at what will probably happen in the more distant future. Currently, over the last year, a lot of SPACs did an IPO, and now the 2-year time frame to look actually for a business combination for a target company has started, and that's like a quite tight time frame to do that, and also taking into account that there's only a limited amount of suitable candidates, suitable target companies. So it's going to be very interesting to follow closely how which SPACs will succeed actually in looking for a suitable business combination, and if they do so, what will happen with the share price of that, of the business combination once that is the listed company. And I think that if a lot of those SPACs will be successful, then I expect many more SPACs to come.
Yeah, definitely. I guess if people see the success of those vehicles,
exactly,
they'll be more attracted to do it themselves. And Emma, do you share similar views to Anne Fleur? What are your thoughts on the future of SPACs?
I share the same views as Anne Fleur. Also, what is very interesting for me was also that the European Securities and Market Authority issued a public statement. I think it was somewhere in July of this year, on the prospectus disclosure requirements of the EU prospectus regulation, what we have discussed here as well. To enhance the comprehensibility and the comparability of SPAC prospectuses, and the intention of the European Securities and Markets Authority was actually to have guidance to help the national authorities in Europe to take a coordinated approach to the scrutiny of SPAC prospectuses, and to support investors' analysis of these transactions. And in my view, having a clear and harmonized rules will create a more sustainable and mature European SPAC market. So we see also the regulators stepping in and maturing the market, to say so.
Definitely. I guess that stability and regulation again will make it a more attractive proposition and make people feel more comfortable entering into one. And Arnaud and then Pascal, what do you believe is next for SPACs? Do you have anything to add from what we've just heard?
From my side, of course, I have no crystal ball like my colleague, right? Certainly, the European markets are less saturated than the US market, so there's room for growth in the immediate future. What I said at the very beginning, I think, is important from our perspective, is that SPACs, beyond the specific feature, are also a way for or are contributing to diversifying and facilitating access to capital markets. So in itself, SPAC is a good development. Now, of course, there are inherent risks that come with the structure, and this is why it is crucial to highlight, understand, mitigate these risks. And this is the role of the regulators and market infrastructures like exchanges to provide the framework and the guidance that the market needs. And if we do that, and if we do it in the right way, there should be bright days for SPACs.
Indeed, and lots of work for you all to do to assist in listing those. And Pascal, what are your closing thoughts? What's the future of SPAC?
Good question. I think it's the same view for sure, but and I don't have any crystal ball either. So, but at the end of the day, I think the key words for SPACs in the future are regulation and protection investors. That's something we let's say the regulatory body needs to develop just to make sure that the market is booming. So that's a key component. And to be honest, looking at the US market, the US SPAC market moved beyond, I would say, the irrationality from early this year. But the pendulum may now be swinging too far in the opposite direction, because it will take courage for SPAC investors to stick to their strategies in these changing times. That's a challenge for the US investors. But I truly believe with adequate regulation, irrationality should disappear to leave room to a growing market in several jurisdictions, as I mentioned before, meaning still in the US, UK, Singapore, Luxembourg, Netherlands, but maybe more rational and maybe even peaceful. That's my feeling for the coming months at the level of the stock market.
Sure, really interesting. Thank you, Pascal. Okay, I'm keen to now get on to a couple more questions from our audience. And as I know, a lot have come through. Just perhaps a couple of quick ones. And Fleur, could you maybe take this one in terms of what SPAC due diligence challenges have you come across?
Well, actually, I was a bit surprised by the question because there are not a lot of SPAC due diligence challenges when it comes to SPAC, because first we have the SPAC IPO, and of course the SPAC is a business, is a company, but it has no operational business. So the due diligence there can be quite limited because there are no financials, no customer contracts whatsoever. It's just a shell company. So due diligence on a SPAC, there is not really any due diligence. Of course, when it comes to the target to the target company, well, then of course you will have to do due diligence. But that due diligence is, of course, the scope and whether it's very complex. That really depends on the type of business of the target company itself. But what is more, but what really helps is that that company is still a private company, so you don't have to take into account like market abuse rules. So no, I don't really see any big challenges there.
Okay, and just very quickly as well, what are the, I don't know who could help on this one in terms of the costs of a SPAC, kind of in as a percentage of the funds raised. Any thoughts on that? Or Arno, is there anything you can comment on?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question to answer because it also really depends on the amount of money the sponsors actually want to put in themselves compared to the offering size. So that's a point to consider. It depends on what type of lawyers you will engage. Will there also be US lawyers involved? How expensive the incorporation of a company is. If you go for, let's say, a Cayman incorporated SPAC, then you also need Cayman counsel on board. So there's a lot of different considerations to take there. So I think that's a very difficult question to answer, but maybe someone else on the panel has different views on that.
No, thank you so much for helping. Any different views, Emma? Any thoughts there?
Well, I agree with Anne Fleur, and also it depends on how much do you want to do internally by yourself and how much do you want to outsource once it's listed, because we see some sponsors saying, okay, we want to outsource everything, for example, to IQEQ, and we see some sponsors saying, okay, we want to do it internally. So that also really depends.
Sure, makes sense. And another question here, Arno, perhaps you can take this one. From what you've seen, what are the most popular sectors that SPACs have been listed in?
That's a challenging one, honestly. I don't think I could put a particular sector in the spotlight. So I don't know whether my colleagues would actually feel comfortable doing so, but.
Sure. And Fleur, I see or Pascal, please.
No, but to be honest, SPACs is only a vehicle. I would say something like a PV. So when you look at the trend for investment at the private equity level, that's the same using or not a SPAC. So if infrastructure is a key, I would say, a target for the next investment for PE firm, it will be the trend for SPACs. So it's not a question of SPACs or not SPACs. It's just a question of what's the trend in terms of investment, and maybe investor would be using SPACs because it's more convenient, or maybe it's quite pragmatic. You can have a pragmatic approach with SPACs. It's not a question SPACs or not SPACs. Just a question what could be the right investment for now.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, what perhaps is worth mentioning here is that it is a fact, or at least some regulators at least will be very requiring in terms of clarifying in the SPAC documents. What are the sectors, what are the regions that are being targeted, right?
Sure. Okay. And Fleur, I see you've got something to add there as well.
Yeah, so indeed, in prospectuses I have been working on, and I think that also is the case for prospectuses in other EU member states. You also have to include like the business combination acquisition criteria, setting out like the general guidelines that the board will probably, but they can deviate from that, take into account when choosing a suitable target company. Most focus sectors I have seen, but that can be just, that's like an example, and it can be different in other EU member states, but it's like the financial tech sector, also ESG, that's also very popular, financial services, those kind of sectors I've seen coming along quite often.
Really interesting. Yeah, perhaps again, as we have more time, as time goes on, we'll have more data around where the activity is as well. But I believe that is all we have time for today. Thank you so much, speakers, for your time. It's been really great to hear your views and your expertise. And thanks to our listeners for listening and sticking with us today. I'm sure our experts here will be more than happy to help if anyone has any particular questions that they'd like to kind of get in touch with them after this conversation. But for now, thank you so much. And thanks all for taking part.